Let's talk about sex, baby. Because back in the day, we didn't have like TikTok or anything, so we had to do it the old-fashioned way. We had to make out with someone. Well, maybe not everyone. The year is 1347, and welcome back to my channel where we bring you the craziest and weirdest facts from human history. Viewer discretion is advised for this episode as some of this stuff is pretty messed up. In today's episode, we will learn about the horrible disease that wiped out half of Europe. Ready? Let's dive right in. Sex was not really a thing during the outbreak of the Black Death. There were numerous taboos surrounding it, especially during the onset of the plague. For starters, having sex during an outbreak was seen as inviting the devil into your relationship. After all, he was thought to be the one spreading the disease. Secondly, it was believed that sexual intercourse could spread the disease. That might actually be true since the plague was spread by fleas that lived on rats. But wait, there's more. People believed that if a woman experienced sexual intercourse while she was pregnant, the baby would be born with a misshapen head. Also, women who engaged in sex during the plague were suspected of being witches. These beliefs prevented many young couples from getting married. Marriages during the plague dropped by around 50%. This led to a sharp decline in the birth rate throughout Europe. When the plague first arrived in Europe, it was mistakenly thought to be a milder version of the bubonic plague. However, it quickly became apparent that this was a much more deadly disease than anyone had anticipated. Initially, people tried to treat it with the same methods that had worked for other diseases. However, this proved ineffective, and the death toll continued to rise. As the plague spread throughout Europe, people began to panic. They started to believe that the world was ending and that the only way to stop the disease was to find a scapegoat. One group that was often targeted was the Jewish community. Many people believed that the Jews were poisoning wells and spreading the disease on purpose. This led to violence against the Jews, and many were killed. Another group that was blamed for the plague was women who were accused of being witches. This was due to the fact that women were seen as weaker and more susceptible to the influence of the devil. This led to the execution of many innocent women who were simply trying to help others during a difficult time. The most common method used to execute these accused witches was burning. They were burned alive in order to cleanse them of their impurities and drive out the devil. The executions were carried out by local officials and were meant to be a warning to others who might be tempted to practice witchcraft. During the outbreak, there was a lot of misinformation and confusion surrounding how the disease was transmitted. People did not understand the concept of germs and bacteria, so they came up with their own theories. One popular belief was that the disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, which were believed to be the key to good health. Another belief was that the disease was a punishment from God for people's sins. This led to people engaging in flagellation, which is the practice of whipping oneself as a form of religious discipline. They believed that this would help to restore the balance of the humors and appease God. Some people even went as far as to cover themselves in the blood of animals in order to protect themselves from the disease. Despite these efforts, the plague continued to spread and death toll rose. The bubonic plague was a devastating event that had a profound impact on European history. It is estimated that it killed around 25 million people in Europe, which was nearly half of the population. The plague had a significant impact on the social, economic, and political landscape of Europe. It led to the decline of the feudal system and the rise of the merchant class. It also had a major impact on art and literature, with many works exploring themes of death and decay. One of the most famous works of art created during this time was a painting called The Triumph of Death. This painting depicts the Black Death as a skeleton-like figure riding a horse and scattering corpses as he goes. It is a powerful image that captures the devastation wrought by the plague. Another famous work of art created during this time was a series of etchings by the artist Alberto Durero. The series, known as the Apocalypse, depicts the four horsemen of the apocalypse, with one representing death. Durero's work is particularly interesting because he was one of the few artists who lived through the plague and was able to document it in his work. But it wasn't just visual arts that were affected by the plague. Literature also saw a shift in tone and subject matter during this time. One example is a book called The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. This book tells the stories of a group of young people who flee Florence to escape the plague, and while hiding in the country, they tell each other stories to pass the time. The stories vary in tone, but many of them deal with themes of death and the folly of human behavior. Another literary work that was influenced by the plague was a poem called The Lady of the Lake by Sir Thomas Malory. The poem is set during the time of King Arthur and tells the story of a knight who goes in search of a magical lake. The knight encounters many obstacles along the way, including a deadly dragon, but he eventually succeeds in finding the lake and retrieving the sword Excalibur for King Arthur. While this may not seem obviously connected to the plague, the poem reflects the turmoil and uncertainty of the time period. The knight's quest is fraught with danger, and he must rely on his wits and courage to overcome the obstacles in his way. This mirrors the struggle that people endured during the plague as they tried to stay alive and maintain some sense of order in their lives. The bubonic plague was a terrible tragedy that affected millions of people, and it continues to fascinate and terrify us today. Its impact on European history was profound, and it helped to shape the world we live in today. From the decline of feudalism to the rise of new art forms, the plague had a lasting impact on society. As we look back on this dark chapter of history, we can remember the millions of people who lost their lives and learn from the mistakes of the past as we work to create a better future. Even though things were bad for our ancestors back in the 14th century, they made it through the plague. A few centuries later, life got a whole lot worse with the emergence of the Black Plague. The Black Plague was a horrifying disease that swept through Europe and Asia in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 25 million people. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which was carried by fleas that lived on rats. The symptoms of the disease were absolutely horrific, including fever, chills, headaches, weakness, and painful swellings in the lymph nodes called buboes. The buboes could grow to be the size of an egg or even larger and would often burst, releasing pus and blood. If you managed to survive the plague, it was likely that you had been exposed to the bubonic plague, which was named for the painful swellings or buboes that developed in your lymph nodes. If you survived the plague, you would have experienced symptoms like a high fever, weakness, and aches, and pains. But the worst part would have been the buboes, which would have been incredibly painful and could have grown to be the size of a fist. The plague was spread by fleas that lived on rats. And the disease was particularly deadly during the Middle Ages because people lived in such close proximity to rats and other animals. People would often keep their animals inside their homes, and the animals would carry diseases that would then be passed on to humans. The lack of basic sanitation also contributed to the spread of the plague, as people would often live in filth, and disease would spread easily from person to person. If you were a victim of the plague, you would have had a very grim prognosis. The mortality rate for the bubonic plague was around 60%, and there was no cure for the disease. Treatment was usually focused on relieving the symptoms and helping the patient to stay comfortable while they waited to die. Unfortunately, this was usually not very effective, and most people who contracted the plague died horrible and painful deaths. So what would it have felt like to contract the plague? Imagine being in the middle of a crowded medieval city when suddenly you start to feel the first symptoms of the plague. You have a fever, you feel weak, and you develop painful swellings in your lymph nodes. As the days go by, the swellings grow larger and more painful, and you become increasingly weak and nauseous. You can barely move, and you feel like you are burning up from the inside. Then the buboes burst, releasing pus and blood. You scream in pain as the liquid drains from your body, and you feel like you are losing your mind. As your body weakens, you realize that you may not survive. You think about your loved ones and wonder if they will be able to cope with your death. You try to make peace with God, but you can't help but feel angry and scared. Your vision starts to blur and you feel yourself slipping away. This is what it would have felt like to contract the plague. Life in the 14th century was not easy. but it sucked being human. What do you think? Did you enjoy today's episode? What would you have done if you were a human in the 14th century? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, and leave a comment.